Welcome, everybody. I'm joined today by Baldev Bhinder, who's Managing Director of Blackstone and Gold in Singapore. Welcome, Baldev.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks. We've been hearing a lot recently about supply chain finance companies and some of the risks around that. I wonder if you could define for me who really bears the risk in these supply chain finance setups.
Good question. And I think if you ask it to the different participants, you'll get a different answer as well. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the buyer. The buyer is the one that's typically a large corporate. That buyer then gets somebody else to pay for him, effectively gets the supply chain funder to pay for him in advance of its own payment obligation. The funder is effectively the one, in my mind at least, who's taking the risk. So the funder looks at a large corporate buyer and think, yes, a big, large MNC. Of course, their balance sheet. Of course, their books are good enough to take credit on them, and they then disperse money onto the supplier. If I was to rank it in terms of sliding scale of risk, and I think most funders wouldn't agree with me, it would be the funder that takes on the most risk, followed by the buyer for a different set of reasons, and the third would be the supplier. Naturally, the supplier is actually in the most favorable position because it gets paid early. Its main risk is if for whatever reason it supplies goods to the buyer and the financing company goes down, which isn't, I mean, we haven't seen too many of those instances. It would probably be the situation where the buyer starts over leveraging and then tips over.
So, I mean, it seems like there's a chain of risk that's across the three companies involved. But are there particular practices or particular kind of warning signs that somebody going into one of these relationships should look out for in order to minimize that risk?
Very much so, very much so. And once again, taking it from the different participants, the three participants in the supply chain. On the buyers, let's take the supplier's perspective. From the supplier's perspective, typically they are a small supplier dealing with a large MNC. The large MNC will probably say, I have a fixed supply chain program. If you want to do business with me, you sign up with this. You will get your funds, you will get your invoices paid earlier than expected. Your cost of funding, put it that way, is actually lower for you. And effectively, it helps working capital for everyone. So that's the sales pitch to the supplier. On the flip side, though, the supplier is told, listen, since you are paying, you're going to get paid in any case on day number 30, for example. So why don't we extend your payment terms on paper to day number 90, 120, and so on? And that's where it starts getting a bit murky because the buyer effectively is then sort of leveraging for longer payment terms. And money not paid today means money saved and used somewhere else from the buyer's perspective. And that's where you get into this danger of over leveraging. At the same time, there's this ongoing debate about how supply chain financing should be accounted for. And this is the biggest risk in particular for not just the supply chain funder, but any lender, any bank involved with these two parties would need to know what leverage is going on between the supplier and also between the buyer. Now, the supply chain company, the funder, it's not able to fully, it's dependent on the buyer for disclosure of what information the type of leverage is on. And it's not readily discernible from accounting statements what part of a buyer's business is leveraged on supply chain. This is because in accounting terms, you don't, payable finance is put under a different category from a bank debt. But effectively, if you take a step back, the argument is that you do supply chain, it is effectively a bank debt. You're actually borrowing money, and that should be classified that way. There are counter arguments, and it's been going on for a while now, and counter arguments both ways. So the point that has to be taken out of this is that understanding leverage and disclosure requirements are critical issues, and you cannot you cannot rely on regulators to regulate for this. It has to be something driven, particularly from the funder itself.
I think you talk about the accounting for supply chain financing and the debate over, whether it should be recorded as debt or as receivables. And I wonder, with that debate ongoing, do you see a difference in regulatory environments across different countries where accounting rules may differ?
Not that I've noticed. I think this is a gap, and I think accounting treatments haven't actually caught up to this level of supply chain financing. Although supply chain financing has been going on for years and years, it's just, I think in the past year or two, more and more the ecosystem, I think, is they're more acute, more alive to the fact of leverage, understanding leverage, because you can have the best balance sheet in the world, but if you're overly if you're tilted to the hilt, then you're going to get catastrophic losses. And I think every now and then, every couple of years, you see one or two famous names going into a catastrophic loss, and most participants say, "I've never seen it. I would have never seen it coming," and that is the real problem. It's supply chain is great. It should be done. It is the way of the future. It's just that there needs to be a bit more transparency so that people can see things coming.
So if the regulatory environment and the market in a way is catching up with the the development and the trends in this sector, and the responsibility for ensuring the security of the arrangement is really placed on the companies involved, how does that work in practice? Are the companies reliant on their accounting firms to carry out due diligence on these companies, or are there any other tools available to just secure them from any greater risk?
Once again, I think the answer I give is not something people want to hear. I would say that you can take core comfort. If you are a lender, you can take core comfort based on the balance sheet, based on the financial statements. And you can take a blinkered view towards it. That's one way of doing it. There's another way of being a bit more proactive and asking the hard questions, because when it comes to lawyers like us, and when we deal with trade fraud cases, or when we deal with catastrophic sort of collapses, we look at the document, and I mean, from hindsight, of course, we get a perfect vision, but we ask the questions as to why wasn't this extent of leverage sort of determined or ascertained at an earlier stage. And I think then you sort of feel the ultimate question is always, could a lender have done more? Could any one of these participants done more to see it coming? And I would say, yeah, I think more proactivity in terms of understanding the business that you are supplying into or lending into would go a long way.
I'm curious, speaking, for the legal sector in general, with news that we've had recently, is this an area where you find business growing? Are more companies coming to legal professionals looking for perhaps some increased security in their contracts?
In terms of the legal work, do we see more legal work in terms of understanding? I would say certainly on the due diligence aspect. So more people are paying attention to the due diligence done when it comes to receivables purchase agreements. That's being looked at again. There's some fairly standard concepts within the receivables purchase framework that is now being relooked again with parties with scrutiny. And I'll give you an example. And one thing in particular is in a receivables purchase, not necessarily supply chain, but any purchase of receivables. An assignment is a critical security in that package. So getting an assignment, ensuring that the buyer tells you that you have to pay the right person, that's quite a critical document. And typically, that we've found cases where the assignment documents have been forged itself. I'm not saying this is what's happened in the past with some of the cases that have hit the public, but there is a risk, and I think there's increased heightened awareness and increased heightened scrutiny on not just the documentation, but also how you get the documentation, because that that risk of forgery, that risk of fraud is so prevalent, because I think the prevailing mindset now is that increasingly lenders are beginning to understand that working capital can be an addictive pursuit.
Thanks, Baldev. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Thomas.